Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Hope you're well today on a very gloomy gray day, at least where I am. Maybe where you are, it is sunny. I certainly hope that's the case. And so welcome to our session on making a funding application. This is for both SeNSS DTP1 and SeNSS DTP2 students. That bit of it will be covering the research, training, and support grant, making application for overseas institutional visit, and also for overseas field work. And then at the final bit of today's webinar, Anna in particular is going to be covering placement applications for those who are SeNSS DTP1 student. So for those of you that are SeNSS DTP2 students, Jenny and I will be offering a separate seminar because there's a little bit of variation between the two doctoral training partnerships in terms of what is expected, but also the application process. Shall we maybe just do a quick whip round of introductions? You may all well know us already, but in case not, so I'm Mark Johnson. I'm SeNSS Deputy Director, SeNSS with a big E, so SeNSS DTP 2, and it's nice to meet you. Anna.
Yes, my name is Anna Canhoto. I have the same role as Mark, but for the first DTP one that started back in 2017.
And I'm Jenny Wilders. I'm the SeNSS DTP2 Training and Development Manager, but I also work closely with Anna on joint training projects.
Wonderful. And Jenny, I think we're starting straight away with you to cover research training support grants.
Yeah, kick off. Okay. So we're first going to talk about the Research Training Support Grant, which is RTSG. So these are funds that are there in place to support you in successfully completing your research project. It's available to all students at whatever part of your studentship you're at, so including master's students. And one thing that is important to remember is that it's not a personal allowance to you. RTSG is pooled funds across everyone that's in the DTP. There's slight variation depending on if you're SeNSS with a little e or SeNSS with a big E as to how much you can apply for each year. If you're DTP1 SeNSS, it's £750 a year or £3,500 over the life of your funded period. And for SeNSS DTP2, it's £1,000 a year or £3,000 over the lifetime of your funding award. And if you don't apply for and awarded the full amount, you can apply for more in the following year, but that is at our discretion. And RTSG is there to cover things such as training, conference attendance, training courses, participant payments, UK fieldwork costs and travel, etc., as well as language training. And in order to be able to apply for it, you have to have completed your DNA each year. So there's a few things that RTSG doesn't cover. So things like laptops and any other standard equipment that your university is expected to provide. There's a separate approval process for applying for equipment. And if you are given permission to purchase equipment and it costs over £200, it is expected that you return it to SeNSS at the end of your studentship or when you've finished with that equipment. And RTSG is also there not to cover things such as stationery or books and journals that may be available through your university. And now there's differentiation in how people apply for RTSG depending on which DTP you're part of. So if you're SeNSS with a little e, so that means that you started before October 2024, there's a specific application form which is found on the VLE. So you set out what you want to spend the money on, how much you need to give quotes. It can be screenshots or links to substantiate your claim. And then you need to send the form to your supervisor to support your application. And then you need to send the application form to your university's administrative lead. Now, on the VLE, there is a list of all the different admin leads and their contact details. So if you're not sure, you can find it on there. If your RTSG claim is for less than £750 a year or £3,500 across the whole of your studentship, your administrative lead can approve it. If your application has gone over those amounts, then it needs to come to SeNSS to approve it as well. And the key thing that Felicity always likes us to reiterate is that you mustn't spend any money before your application has been approved. And then once you've had approval and you've spent your funds, you then need to provide your receipts to your administrative lead, and you need to follow the expenses reimbursement process relevant to your local institution to be refunded the money. Now, we in SeNSS, we do keep records of the RTSG funds that are spent, but again, we advise you to keep your own records. And then for SeNSS DTP2 students, so that's if you started last October 2024, oh no, 2 years ago now, sorry, Lee. So if you started on or before October 2024, SeNSS with a big E, again, there's an application form which is on the VLE, and similar, you need to set out what the RTSG is to be used for and include quotes and web links, etc., to substantiate the expenses. The supervisor then also needs to support it. And now this is the difference. So if you're on DTP2, your application forms have to be sent to me. And then you'll get the approval from me rather than from your institution. But again, you shouldn't spend any money before your application has been approved. But once you've spent your funds, then the reimbursement process is through your institution. So you'd have to provide receipts to whoever deals with expenses, etc. But your operational lead will be able to advise you on that process. And if you're not sure who your operational lead is, again, on the VLE, there's a list of contact details for DTP2 as well. And we also say, similarly for DTP1, we also need to keep a record of funds spent, but we'll also keep a record as well. Okay.
And so, thank you, Jenny. Now I'll talk a little bit about another source of funding, which is the overseas institutional visits. So the overseas institutional visits, or OIVs, these are awards that we give to students to spend a limited period of time in a research institution outside of the UK. Okay, so these period of time usually can run up to 3 months. It doesn't have to be 3 months, it can be less. It does have to be a research institution, though. So this is typically a university or a research center. Sometimes it could be the research arm of another organization, for instance, a company that may have a big multinational that might have a research arm to understand consumer behavior or materials or employees or something like that. So that could be it. But what is critical here in a OIV is that this visit needs to be very strongly linked to your research and to your profile as a researcher. So whereas, for instance, a placement, which we're going to talk about later, is about expanding your profile and CV, and you may go into an area that is a bit outside of what you've been doing. In the OIV, we really need to see a very close link with what you're doing already. So for instance, if you this could be you are citing an author, for instance, in a your research depends heavily on a particular group or author, and you're going out you want to spend some time with this group or author. Or it could be you have a technique, use a particular technique, and this lab is, or this group is very strong on this technique, right? So you will have to mention in your application how doing this visit will help develop your network, will help you develop some specific skills. Or maybe sometimes you're going to present your early research findings and hope to get some feedback on that you're going then to write, or somebody did a study on a different population and you're going to compare. So these kind of things. If you're going to, sometimes students apply to go to these places to get training on something. So here we would need to see that the training cannot be accessed remotely or is not available in UK. So we wouldn't typically fund you to go to Germany to get something on literature reviews, because we do offer training on literature reviews already. So next slide, please. So what do we include here? Typically, so we fund up to £4,000. It doesn't have to be £4,000, and we do encourage you to go below, because then we have a limited funding. If you go below this money, we can award more. So we have a limited amount of money we can give per call. And in the past, I've been able to extend the number of visits that I fund, because people ask for less money than the 4,000. So I do encourage you to think about this as a limit, not a target. This typically is for travel, because it's overseas visit. You will need to travel, you will need a place to stay, and subsistence costs. Subsistence costs will be in addition to your studentship. So if you would only give you additional subsistence costs, if it's more expensive than being in London, it will only be the difference, or wherever you are, right? Some students, instead of spending, say, 2 or 3 months there, want to go for a period, come back, then go back. And we are happy to accept this because, of course, you are spending more on travel, but then you don't have to stay, which may pay off. It's all about the rationale, right? But it will be more than 3. We wouldn't typically fund more than 3 back and forth visits because we do want you to absorb the culture and things like that. So typically it will be on flights, visas, accommodation. And something that I want to emphasize is that we really expect you to go and look for additional sources of funding for this. It will count negatively on your application if you have not looked at the sources. Maybe you didn't get them. That's fine, but you need to show us that you looked. This could be in your institution, this could be a charity, this could be the local institution. We had cases where the local institution co-funded something. For instance, they lent them a laptop or something like that, right? I want to flag that we're going to have a training session on alternative sources of funding exactly for these kind of things that I strongly encourage you to assist. Why do we expect you to look at other sources of funding? First, because this is part of your training. Mark and I and whenever I want to do something, I need to look for funding for that. My institution is not just going to give me the money to do that. So this is part of your training. Second, because these are limited funds, taxpayer funds, and we want to extend them as much as possible. So we want you to make an effort as well to fund your work. Sometimes it's possible to use part of your RTSG funds to meet OIV costs, and so we encourage you to do that if it's relevant. And something that I want to flag in terms of who can apply for these need to be students. You cannot apply to do an IOV during a master's. You can apply during the master's, but the OIV will need to take place once you formally register for the PhD. And if you are planning to do the OIV in your final year of study, this needs to finish at least 3 months before your end date. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Jenny, sorry. We have 2 calls a year. Typically these are for both DTPs. Typically these are in February and then in the summer. In fact, we're launching one today, so this is a very timely presentation. It will start today. The deadline is in a month's time, and then you will hear your feedback a couple of weeks later. The forms are online on the VLE, so you need to explain the why you want to do this, what exactly you want to do it, and then the details. We do need letters from your supervisor and OIV, and I do look carefully at our OIV letters because we want to see that the institution has engaged with you as an individual researcher. It's not just something. I'll be very happy to host Mark, right? Say, Mark is doing this research, is very relevant for my institute for this, and we are going to do this. I want to see a commitment that your time and money is going to use productively rather than just being there and dropping down to some seminars, right? Because that's not the point of the OIV. If you are approved, it will go through your university's risk assessment policies, things around, traveling to certain destinations or health and safety, things like that. But that is kind of part of the application process. Next. And I hand over to Jenny.
It's over to me. Thanks, Anna. Just one thing to note for SeNSS DTP2 students in particular about the overseas institutional visit. Unfortunately, the funding that we were given by the ESRC for the SeNSS DTP2 wasn't quite as generous as that for SeNSS DTP1. As you'll be aware, the kind of constraints across the sector. But then it means that we only have a very, very limited number of awards to make in terms of the overseas institutional visits. This was just to note that if we receive a number of applications and they are all equally strong, we are likely to make an award in the first instance, in this round, for example, to those who are further along in their PhD. So some of our PhDs in DTP2, they're already in their 3rd years because they came in as 2nd-year students. So just for the sake of transparency, if your application is not successful this time, you can reapply. And that it's just to kind of to make you aware of that, really.
Same for
Um,
DTP1.
Same for there we go. Thanks, Anna. So again, we wish we had unlimited resource, but we don't. So we'll try and make the most of it we can. Overseas fieldwork. So um, just a reminder that overseas fieldwork funding is available to doctoral researchers if you are conducting research outside the UK, which is essential to the successful delivery of your PhD project. Ordinarily, you may only apply for overseas fieldwork funding if you stated that in your original studentship application that you had planned to undertake fieldwork overseas. So this is something that we would have expected to have seen in your original SeNSS application, and that was reviewed and confirmed at the time. So what is the funding available for? Well, it's available to cover costs such as obviously travel, visa applications, accommodation. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Under certain circumstances, if you are also undertaking difficult language training, you may also apply for overseas fieldwork funding to support you if that language training must be overtaken overseas. Often these kind of coincide with each other. And again, we would ordinarily expected you to have indicated in your SeNSS application that you were needing to undertake difficult language training. Let me just come back to the question about accommodation. Again, as Anna mentioned for the overseas institutional visit, our expectation is that you will use your regular stipend to pay for your subsistence costs while you're doing your overseas fieldwork. However, we recognize that, for example, if you may have a long-term tenancy agreement or something in the place that you're ordinarily resident when you're in the UK attending university, and therefore you need be able to cover additional accommodation costs, or you're proposing to do fieldwork in a place that is more expensive to live than where you are currently located. You just need to set that out very clearly in the application that you submit, so that we have a really good rationale for why you're applying for additional costs, for example, for accommodation in that kind of way. As with the overseas institutional visit, there's also a cap on the amount of funding available that you can apply for, and that's £8,000. And again, you need to make sure that it's set out in a very kind of clear, well thought out way, and that all the costs are reasonable here. And the amount awarded will be determined by ourselves when we review it, regardless of how much you've applied for. Let's go to the next slide, please, Jenny. So the application process. You must apply for funding using the overseas fieldwork application form that you will find on the VLE. Just to know, if you're not that familiar with navigating the VLE, the application form for all the things that we've talked about today, if you go straight into the handbook for whether you're a SeNSS DTP1 student or a SeNSS DTP2 student, you go to the relevant section of the handbook that covers that, and you'll find there the detailed policy about that, as well as the application form for each of these. We suggest that you should apply at least 2 calendar months before you intend to travel. I would highly recommend that you apply well in advance of that. Make sure you're having these conversations very early on with your supervisors about what you are planning to do in terms of overseas fieldwork. Because really at the point of application, you will need to know, A, what are the visa costs? Have you initiated that process? Sometimes, depending on where you want to undertake fieldwork, that visa application process can be a very long time in coming, depending on what is required in the particular place that you're intending to do your field work. You may need a specialist researcher's visa, for example, and that can sometimes take a lot of time. So don't leave this to the last minute, and having a good sense of what is going to be required for that will also inform your application for the funding that you need. The other thing I would note is that you're required to confirm that you've gone through the relevant risk management, and of course, you should also understand within that any ethical approvals applications that you need to do. All of these things should be well in place, or at least well along the way to be in place by the time you get to the point of confirming your funding application. These are the things that we're going to be looking for you to confirm. So once you've completed your section application, you will email it, of course, to your supervisor for their supporting statement. And then you would forward your application to the person designated by your university to deal with these. This would normally be the SeNSS administrative lead, or what SeNSS calls the operational lead. Sometimes it's the same person. If you're in a partner that is in both SeNSS with a small e and SeNSS with a large e. Then they will review their application. If it's in line with policy, we'll forward it to the SeNSS manager or their designate for consideration. Often, then it comes to Jenny, and I may be asked to read and review and comment on your application. We may come back to you with questions about your application if we think there's things that are not clear, either about the budget, or we just want to make sure that all the processes necessary to ensure that you're ready to go to do that overseas fieldwork are in place. We may well come back to you with questions and queries. Please don't take them that we are looking to put obstacles in the way. We just want to make sure everything is right in terms of ensuring that you are going to be have everything in place for you, including things like travel insurance. Have you done all the necessary clearances? You've checked that the destination you're proposing to travel to is not in a prescribed list by the Foreign Commonwealth Office for example, and that everything is in place and proper as it should be. So we will look at that within SeNSS, and we'll aim to get a decision to you normally within 2 weeks. Of receipt, and then hopefully you'll be able to kind of continue your planning for that. Is there another slide on this, Jenny, or is that it? Oh, we do. Some application tips. And we might all come in here. So the general thing is make sure that you are including quotes of any expenses and provide evidence. We want to, again, as Anna said, ensure that there's good value for money here. And we appreciate sometimes that you need to balance off the overall costs with the kind of both the flexibility, for example, of things that would enable you to change tickets, for example, which can be more costly than something that you have to travel on that date, and which would jeopardize things if you didn't. So there's things to balance out, but explain things. Explain, if you've provided a series of quotes, explain why you think the particular one you've chosen is the best and the different reasons for that. Read the rules on what is an allowable expense. Don't submit claims and make us go back to you and say, you can't have that because it's clearly here. We've set that out. You need to explain what you're going to do and why. And don't be too ambitious or too vague. Just set it out very concretely. We don't expect the world, for example, if you're applying things, but be clear about what it is you want to accomplish and achieve. And particularly, as Anna said very early on, make sure that you link it very clearly to why it is you're proposing in relationship to your PhD thesis research. How do these things fit together? Anna, do you want to come in and take a few of the next points?
Yeah, and again, the reason we're doing this is because it's something that as a researcher you will need to do. I always need to justify again when I'm for a budget why it's essential for the project and things like that. Sorry, where were we in terms of the bullet points?
I was talking about the letter of support.
Yes. So the letter of support, sorry, I got lost a little bit. Yeah, the letter of support from the institution, we will want 2 letters of support, one from a supervisor confirming again how this links to your study and confirming that they will maintain contact with you, how often you are, so how this links to your project and how often you're meeting. And then from the institution, we want to see the person who is going to be your contact there. So it can't be just a general letter. There is someone that you're going to work with and is going to host you, and we want a letter from that person detailing, yes, I will meet and say your names. So it needs to be as personalized as possible and as relevant to your application as possible, kind of in general. We want to see your name, we want to see the dates, we want to see we are going to this and that. This research is relevant for us because we will help the student with these specific things. All of that will strengthen. Again, it's something that I need to include in all my research applications with partners, these very specific things. Something that I want to say in general is that we do not always give all, even if we approve, we may not give you all the money that exactly you ask, right? Because sometimes we may see that, for instance, you may be asking for things that are not eligible, or that we think there is a cheaper alternative or things like that. So it's possible that we will approve, but by less money than you ask for. But it's always better if you are realistic in terms of what you're asking for. Okay, I think that's all right, Mark.
I think that's all. And just again, in terms of the overseas fieldwork applications, make sure that you are really well prepared and ready to do this, that you've made all the necessary contacts. The point here is encouraging you to have, I'd always encourage my students who are planning to do research internationally, that they have an institutional affiliation in the country that they're planning to do research. It could be, again, and it's distinct from the overseas institutional visit, but actually having affiliation with researchers in your area based at local universities, that is always best practice. And they're also such an enormous and important source and wealth of expertise and knowledge. So developing and cultivating those relationships early is really, really important for that.
Something that sometimes when I talk with students, I think it also helps you if you consider very carefully what are the risks involved and have a contingency plan, right? I think sometimes people feel that I shouldn't flag this potential problem because it's going to raise, people are not going to like, but it's the opposite. So for instance, you might say, this is a point of contact if this person is not available. There was one case when a student wanted to go expecting to do some data. What happens if this is canceled? I can still get value because of these. What happens if this person is not available? For instance, is sick leave or parental leave, whatever. There is still that thing that I can do. So I think actually recognizing the risks and developing contingency plans strengthens your application rather than just say this is perfect, there are no problems, because we know there are problems and it just seems less realistic.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. And then that final point there about making sure you've discussed your application fully with supervisors and that you are acquainted with the travel and insurance requirements at your home institutions. Most of your home institutions should be able to provide you with insurance that will cover you when you're making trips that are related to your own research and program of study, but check with them and make sure that you've got something in writing via email to confirm that that's all in place for you. We've had a number of students, you will know that, listening to the news, all kinds of things happen, whether it's it's weather related or other kind of political issues coming, knowing that you can very easily get somebody at the end of the line, or if something happens to you and you're sick and you need to be evacuated, you need to know who you call, that is in place, and that those things will be ready to go should it be required, which of course we hope it won't be, but having it in place is the important thing. Jenny, did you want to add anything in terms of general tips?
I think just make sure that you've got when you're applying for kind of like the travel and the accommodation, that you've included proof of costs or web links or screenshots, that kind of thing, just to show, because otherwise myself, Felicity, will just be coming back to ask you to provide that. So make sure that your application, as well as all the other points that Anna remarked, but it's well thought out, it's well costed. You've got a range of, I think we asked for 2 travel quotes. So like with airlines, you've gone on Skyscanner, or you've got different airlines, etc., and the accommodation as well. And also bear in mind, some institutions, for example, they won't cover Airbnb. So just make sure that you're looking at any kind of local practices as well when you're looking for like travel and accommodation as well.
Good advice. And often each of your universities will have their own travel provider, and that they normally want you to get a quote from them. And it may be somebody else that you have a quote from as well, but you would always want to have a quote from the university nominated travel provider as part of what you're looking at. Fantastic. Shall we move on to the next bit? And are we at the end of the questions? So do please either put a question in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and come in, you can do that too. Jenny, just double checking. It looks like you've answered the questions in the chat already, but if there's more, please do come in, folk. Question here: is it possible to fund your own institutional visit if not successful? Anna, do you want to?
Yes, you can, because of course you can always go. The point of these additional fund, one is additional funding, and second, it gives you an extension to the deadline. If you fund your own, you do not get that extension to the deadline and the studentship, but you're very welcome to fund.
Yeah.
And of course, it shows resourcefulness and all of those things that are really important for you.
Yeah. Another question here, a question about timelines. When do most people do an OIV? And how does that sit with placements, which might usually be end of year 2 and before the write-up phase? Anna, do you want to come in that?
I think it's a good question, and it shows exactly the importance of linking into the reason. Some people have gone to an OIV because of a specific technique, right? They were using a technique in there for data collection, and these were the experts, and they went there to get training on that specific technique that they were going to use for data collection. Other people come more towards the end, where it's about presenting early findings. There was, as I mentioned, an example, they had done this on this population. It was something around experiences. I can't remember. Anyway, so somebody had done something around a particular country, like things around caste and power and so on, and they were going to South Africa, where they were but different, right? So it could be that you have your findings and you thought it would give you an added dimension of interestingness and so on if you compared with data sets. So it really depends on why you're applying. Having said that, as Mark mentioned, we try, if we can't afford to, if we have, we assess the application on its own merits. But then if 2 or 3 are equally good and we can't afford to all of them, we will try to fund the ones that do not have an opportunity to apply again, right? So also think about that you may apply, you may not get it. We'll try to fund it when you need it, but you can always apply later. Mark, I think that's
Thanks, Anna. Then there's a question here asking about somebody's got connections with the university in the UK. And yes, the answer, so you're asking, would you have to use your RTSG research support grant rather than being able to apply for the overseas institutional visit? And that's correct. That's the way you would have to do that. Yeah, if you want to ask a question, turning on your mic, go ahead, please.
Yeah, it's actually better for us if you do that.
Yes, hello, hi again. Hi, professors. Thank you so much for this informative session today. You mentioned that the funding, especially for the OFW, it's for visa expenses or traveling. But I was wondering, for my part of my research, I would actually utilize the fund more towards data collection or towards a specific treatment that I'm planning in my research. So I would rather utilize the fund that I get from you towards data collection or treatment that I'm planning. And I would rather pay for my flights or accommodation in the international place that I'm going to. So would you think this is a better opportunity, or is this a better idea, rather than utilizing the fund for more academic practices than for accommodation or flights?
You would be well. I mean, if there are things that you need to pay for as part of your overseas research, you can include that in your thing. Jenny, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, just to say that if there's so this is similar, this is where there's kind of an overlap between OFW funding and RTSG. So OFW funding is kind of to get you there and support you whilst you're there. But if you need, for example, equipment, for example, like recording devices or, transcription services, anything like that, that's kind of like is related to the activity of what you're doing whilst you're doing your fieldwork, then that would be under RTSG. So I think when you're talking about data collection, that would be a separate application under RTSG. So you wouldn't include that in your overseas fieldwork application.
But there may be some very specific things that are related to the kinds of research you're proposing to do, and that require, that, in other words, if it's related to the fact that you're doing your research in overseas context, and there's something specific there, right? So, for example, if you need to pay for, even if you've done language acquisition, and you want to pay for, like translation work and things like that, to facilitate that overseas field work, I think that's probably possible. And you might just, drop us a note. Maybe that's the best thing, is just to clarify. If you set out very concretely what you're thinking about, then we can direct you in helping to think about where you should apply for the funding to enable that. For
And
self-funded OIVs,
more
students are
about
more,
terms of the grants.
yeah.
I think this is better if you email if you email us. I think that would be better, because I think it would have to do with things like visas and stuff like that. So
That's right. I think what's being hinted at here is that there was, in terms of the expectations of UKRI in terms of people's normal place of study and things like that. So yeah, probably the best thing to do is, if you're trying to self-fund an OIV, drop us a note in terms of what you're planning there. I would have thought probably we can make a reasonable case for that. I think what the other is really intended to prevent is people basically, the expectation is that normally you're doing your study in the UK, and then you're accessing the sorts of support that you're able to within your home institution and that kind of thing. But if there's good reason and you're not able to fund it through an OIV for you to be elsewhere, I think it makes entire sense.
Chiara?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I just wanted to follow up. So I'm thinking about an OIV because there are two academics in Sweden that I'm both looking at quite closely for different reasons. They're at different universities, but within proximity to one another. And they're so, like, my field is quite niche, and they're so important to what I'm doing that yeah, I've seriously been considering applying for an OIV later on in the process. But I wondered, like, is that a substantial enough reason, if it's not that I want to do anything connected to the context of Sweden specifically, but that I'd like to kind of be able to shadow them for a bit and get feedback, and maybe, be there for like a month or so. Is that a substantial reason that you would consider?
So so it doesn't have, you don't have to do something specific to Sweden at all.
Mm.
It is all about how this adds value to you and your PhD and your research, right? So it happens that they're there, and in order to access these, you need to go there. But if it's something that you could access online or in a conference or somebody, we tend not to fund that, right? It needs to be. And again, it's not that I completely appreciate the value of just being in a place and seeing people and so on, but because of the limited funds, we need to see where there is something tangible, direct benefit to your research. It doesn't matter that it's Sweden, it could be another place, but it needs to be very closely linked to your research.
Sure. Okay, so maybe tying it into sort of later findings and presenting as well might be a stronger proposal. Yeah.
Something
Thank
like
you.
that. Yeah.
Okay.
And presumably,
for
oh, sorry, Anna, go ahead.
instance, you said getting feedback, yeah, but make that when there is a letter, we are committed to giving feedback and helping Chiara develop, blah, blah, blah. It's not just, I'm going to present and I hope to get some feedback, because you can get that sort of feedback anywhere. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And I was just going to add to that, presumably those folks, if they're working in a specialist area, they may have their own PhD students, right? So it could be that, the opportunity to share and hear from others working in a related area with them. That's all kind of things that you would add into that kind of thinking about what you might do and proposing to them.
Great, thank you.
Will we move to the placements?
I think so.
Yeah.
Jenny, do you want to just say something
Glad
about
to see this. Yeah, so before we move on to the DTP1 placements, just to highlight to DTP2 students that Mark and I are going to be holding a webinar on the 5th of February. And this is going to cover identifying a suitable placement and planning an application. And again, this is going to cover points such as the type of placement opportunities available, how you find opportunities, guidance on how to complete your application form, and also any Q&A. And you should already have received a link for the webinar, but if not, it's on this slide. And again, it's also going to be recorded and uploaded onto the VLE afterwards. But as for DTP2 students, placements are an integral part of your studentship and funding period. We do expect attendance at this webinar. So just to kind of make that point to everyone.
So thanks, Jenny. And so just to be clear, if you're a DTP2 student, you're welcome to stay, but actually I would encourage you not to stay because the next bit is really only for DTP1 students because there are really different requirements for DTP2 students, and that's what Jenny and I will be covering. So we'll say goodbye to you as a DTP2 student, and DTP1 students, you're very welcome to stay. And well, we want you to stay because Anna's going to be covering what to do for DTP1 placement applications.
Yeah, but it will cause confusion for DTP2. So
yeah.
Excellent. So let's see. Just wondering if anyone is leaving. See how many people are left. Assuming there are some. If not, just the three of us. Okay, so I'm assuming the 5 students left, I think, from DTP1. Okay, we'll make a start. So, so the big difference, well, there are several different, but the key difference between DTP1 and DTP2 is that DTP placements are compulsory for DTP students, but are optional for DTP1 students. Okay, so and because of this, you need to go through a competition, just like for OIVs. Placements, so they are optional. It's something that you typically do in the UK. We wouldn't typically fund placements outside of the UK unless it's very well justified and there is a very good reason for doing that. And to be clear, you can still do a placement. You can still spend time at an institution learning, for instance, about public engagement or producing dissemination materials or communicating with policy or something like that. Even if you do not get funding. The key difference is that by getting, as with the OIV, by getting the funding, you get an extension to your studentship. You get 3 additional months in your studentship and your deadlines and so on. So you can always do a studentship. We might call it, say, an internship in the summer, right? But to get the extension, you need to apply for the placements. Next slide, Jenny. So it can run up to 3 months, somewhere between 1 month and 3 months. And the grant is up to 2,500 in cost. This is typically transport, right? So if you're doing, for instance, typical placements have been working with the parliament, or we had people working with companies, commercial companies. This wouldn't be at another research institution. Typically, it will be at a company or government or things like that. So you typically have travel expenses. You might have sustainable food is one if it is markedly more expensive than you are, and you would only pay the difference. Sometimes you need to get insurance, so your employer may, the place where you go for placement may require you to get a insurance, and your institution doesn't cover that, so that could be included. We also had cases of students where they applied for a placement and they were receiving a salary, or they or the placement, the host covered travel and so on. So you didn't need these additional 2,500, but people still applied because they got that extension, that 3 months extension in the studentship. And I would encourage you to do that again, because you get extension and you get more money for others. Next slide. So you typically, if the funding is not enough, you can use your RTSG funds. For instance, if you need to, you may want to attend a workshop as part of that placement or so on. And as with any other funding, you're very much encouraged to look for additional funds internally or in institutions to complement. I would always ask your host institution, because they typically have some money that they can spare, because it's for them, it's actually tax. They can deduct in tax, for instance, to pay for your travel or to pay for some expenses that you may incur to acquire data or do something. So always consider asking the host institution for some funding, because they can typically help to some extent. Next. As with the OIV, master students, you can apply, but you cannot do the placement during the masters. It needs to be done once the PhD has started. But if you know you want to do it in the summer of your first year, you can apply now. And for final year students, as with the other ones, you need to finish the internship you need to finish the placement at least 3 months before the funding award end date. So keep that in mind when you apply. And be careful that you can only receive funding once, so you cannot do more than once, and you can only start after the placement has been approved. You cannot do retroactive applications. But you can, of course, if you don't get it this year, you can apply next time and so on, and we will look at that when we are judging your application. Jenny, next one. So we have four times a year. We used to have 2 calls a year, just like with the OIV. But now we realize that actually to be a bit more what happens is that some people miss the deadline and then they wanted to consider that. So now we have 4 applications a year, February, May, August, and November, to make sure that we can catch more of you, because sometimes institutions like UKRI or the Parliament, they will advertise things at very specific dates. And this here gives more flexible, these extended call, the fact that we have more calls allows us to fund more of you and react to those opportunities. The application form is on VLE, and as with the others, you will need to apply. You need to have a completed form and letters of support from the supervisor and the host organization and your university. Usually it takes us around 2 working weeks, 14 working days to revise the application. We try to be as responsive as we can, but of course we need to be fair and thorough. Next slide. So what you need to do in terms of to make sure that you get the placement. You would be surprised how many times the form doesn't include everything that it needs to do. So make sure that every section is completed, including the risk assessment. There is no information missing. You have all the letters, and you meet eligibility criteria, for instance, in terms of how much time you have left in your studies. You also need to make sure, if we ask you for 2 quotes or for travel or 3, make sure that you include them. If you only have 1, then you're not meeting these criteria. I need to be chasing you, or either not consider your application or chase you to meet those things. So this is kind of the basics. Other than that, of course, we're looking at the purpose of the placement. The point of a placement is not to collect data for your PhD, and it's typically, on the other end, it's more about enriching your CV. So doing something beyond the program of what you're doing for your research. Typically, this could be things like, for instance, imagine that you're doing something about education. You may want to do a placement in a school just to understand, not about your research, but understanding how a school works and the dynamics and other things. We also sometimes use policy. Many people do placements in policy, so to understand, again, for instance, how research is done in a policy, in a government institution. How is it different from the research you're doing? It's not that you're not going to use that for your PhD, but you're learning, developing new skills, and understanding audiences. So typically, producing dissemination materials, understanding the dynamics of the stakeholders that are important for you as a research, but not necessarily for the PhD. So you want to show, so what is it that you're gaining from the placement? What is it in your, if you think about your DNA profile and you just completed your DNAs, you have all these areas of professional development, and some will be fulfilled by your PhD, and other areas will be developed by things like the placement. So linking it to a specific area of DNA, it will be very good for you. You want to say how this works with the overall plan. For instance, if you are at a critical stage of data collection, this is not a good time to do the placement because the placement is not linked to the data collection. So you want to say, I just finished this. Before I do that, it would be great to do a placement here. You want to give us a detailed working plan. So you're not saying I'm going to spend 8 weeks here. You say, well, there will be an induction here, and then I'll go to this person and spend here in the office. I'm going to visit the office 3 times a week, and in the other 2, I'm working from home. We want to see this kind of what is going to happen, that you know what is going to happen, and you thought about how that is going to enhance you as a researcher. And then how is that going to help you become a better researcher, really? You need to provide your costings and justified. You're going to say food X because again, you already have your studentship, so you're not typically pay for food. We want if you so you need to justify the cost and be reasonable in what you ask for. I think that's it, right, Jenny? Any questions about the placements from DTP1 students?
Hi, I just wanted to ask if we could use the data we collect on the place, like, say the placement is not mainly for data collection, but say we're writing our observations during it. Can we use that as part of the PhD, or is it a completely separate project?
So typically we wouldn't we wouldn't expect you to use any of the things that you collected in your PhD because right? If you find something really interesting that you think it's extremely important, but that's something to discuss with your supervisor, how you would integrate. You would need to get ethical approval, and it's more your supervisor would have to understand how it linked to your PhD because typically we wouldn't expect you to. Definitely, you're not going there to collect data for your PhD. It may
Yeah,
that in the process of, I think what you're saying is that in the process of doing the placement, you found something interesting that could enhance you.
yeah.
That is possible, but then you need to discuss with your supervisor. Mark, I see you came in. Do you want to say something about it?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Eleanor. I mean, I think Anna's right that it's a kind of if so here's what I say. If you think something might come out of it that could potentially, but recognizing that the placement is, as Anna said, not meant primarily, to be a kind of a data collection thing, you might want to put in a preemptive ethics approval application. If
Okay.
you see what I mean, because
Yeah,
you can't, it's very hard to, well, you can't really reverse engineer an ethics application, right? So if you think that the placement activity might provide insights into things that you're working on, and it may be that it might provide insights in a way that's even adjacent to your thesis research that might lead on to a different sort of publication, for example,
yeah, that's
then
true.
I would always err on the side of caution and put in formally an ethics application and discuss it with the folk that you're intending to do a placement with, so that they're also aware. And this is where the kind of differentiation between the SENS DTP2 things is as well. If as part of your placement you're going to be doing work, with the partner that involves some kind of research, for example, then definitely you'd want to have an ethics application in. Right?
Yeah,
Is that right, Anna?
Yeah, but I think the thing is, from our perspective as hands, it's not a problem that you use the data.
Yes.
But what is a problem is that it's from the quality, the ethics issue and the quality of the research. It needs to make sense for your supervision. But from our perspective, it's not a problem that you use it, but it's not the reason why you go there. Eleanor, does that make sense?
Yeah.
yeah, that does. And is it possible to do, because basically I've been talking with, they're actually my former employer. So we were talking about the possibility of me going there for both purposes, as in to do a project around my PhD and also to do a work placement. But but what I'm hearing is that maybe that I don't know if that's too muddy or if they were two clearly defined projects, would that be acceptable?
So when we are assessing your application, it's about how does this enrich you as a researcher. We're not looking at how does this get more data for the PhD. You are developing a new skill, you're developing your network, right? Something like that.
Yeah,
That's what we're judging on. If you end up collecting data, that's a bonus for DTP1s, right? It could be another publication, but it's not how we are. So it's something to negotiate with the company. But from
sure.
applying for a placement perspective, and again, you can always do the placement even if you don't get the award, right? You can always do
That's
that
true.
with them. But in terms of getting our award and getting that extension, it is about how does it enhance you as a researcher, look at the DNA and what skills you are developing there.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, but it's good. It's always good when your former employer wants to stay connected. So well,
Yeah.
especially in line of research. Brooke and Jane, do you have any questions? Is that clear? Is everything clear?
I think I'm going to ask this just because I don't think you've explicitly said it. So I'd really like to do the placement, and I've been discussing with my supervisor to potentially go to Cambridge and write an impact case study, which would kind of run parallel with my PhD interest, but really just that's kind of where I want to move my career post PhD. So if I applied for the funding and was successful, would I still get my kind of monthly stipend along that? Yeah, you get
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Brilliant. And I think, is that the kind of project that would be, I mean, from what you've just said, I think it would align really well, writing a
So,
kind of case study and an impact case study.
so we typically wouldn't. Typically, the placements are not at other research institutions. That's why we have the OIVs for and things like that, right?
Okay.
The placements will be for companies, government, things like that. So you would need to, but I do understand that writing an impact case study is more of could be more of professional services or research, strategic part of the university rather than doing the research, right? So I
So
think that. Go
sorry,
ahead.
would I apply for an OIV then, even if it was in the
No, no,
UK?
no, no. OIV is just abroad. Do apply for a placement, but you would, I have to say, do apply for a placement. You get to keep your studentship. The fact that it's at a research institution will raise questions for me, and I will want to see what are the skills, additional skills that you're getting by going specifically to Cambridge that you can't get in your own institution, for instance.
Okay, so in just again, just for my own clarity, I think you've kind of touched on this. So for me, it would be about um, doing that kind of case study and accessing those networks and working in a very different institute. Is that the kind of enhancement, or is it more of the
It's
hard
about,
skills, the
I
soft?
think I would link it to the workings of a university rather than the research, right? As part of university, it's so important for universities to understand the REF and impact case studies and understand how would understand how research leads to impact and how you document that. So I would link with that bit of it's not about going to Cambridge, that is different from
Yeah.
institution. It's about having experience of something related to research, which is about producing impact and documenting impact.
Amazing. Thank you. That's so clear. I really appreciate that.
Okay, yes, Eleanor? No, no, you are not, I mean, for the funding, no. You can do it for you if you want to do it personally, but for the funding, no, you need to, it's a pause in your PhD. Of course, you maintain contact with your supervisor during that, but the placement typically is not part-time. Right, Mark?
Trying to remember the rules are for DTP1. For DTP2, you can do it part-time,
Okay.
but for Jenny, what is it for DTP1?
I think, yeah, because I think it is, as Anna said, it is a pause. So I think if you are a part-time student, you can do it part-time, but I'm not, we'd have to check that. So I'm not au fait with the rules of DTP1 placement.
We will, Eleanor, if you email us, we will check, but in principle, I think you cannot. Again, we would expect you to stay in contact with your supervisor and so on, but we wouldn't typically it wouldn't be a part-time.
Okay, thank you.
Or if you do, well, let me phrase it, if you do a part-time placement, presumably wouldn't give you the full 3 months. We would give you just the equivalent to the part-time,
Right.
because we are extending your studentship for 3 months because we assume that you are pausing your PhD for 3 months. If you're continuing, we would only give you a month and a half or something like that. So I think we would need to look carefully at the rules.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Sorry, one more question.
Yes.
So you said that this is going to run 4 times a year now.
Yeah.
So if I didn't so when will be the deadline for this submission?
You can always apply again. So that's
Okay.
if that's the thing. Let me look at the exact deadlines. So it will be in February, May, August, November. So
May, August. And then how long after getting that kind of confirmation does it need to be undertaken? So say I got accepted for February, is there a specific time frame that I would have to do it?
no, in terms of how soon after you need to start it. No, we don't have you don't have to start in the next 2 months, for instance. Typically people do this in the summer or something like that. But of course, if you're applying for to do a placement in 2 years, maybe I would not make the award now because that blocks that money. I can give that money to somebody else, and then you come back later and get. I would expect you to do in the next academic year for sure, but there isn't a specific deadline when you have to start.
Amazing, because I'm just I'm planning I'm trying to write a bid for like the Paul Mellon Foundation as well. So they have like very specific like timeframes of receiving it to running the project, and I'd like to hopefully get that funding and then do them within that time block, but they've not been absolutely specific about the dates yet. So thank you.
Good. Okay. So if there are no more questions, you can always email us. So you have the email already in the chat if you have any other questions. You can always email us with questions. And but anyway, thank you for joining us and good luck with your projects.